to this launch of the 2020 Socialist Register. This marks the 7th decade of the Socialist Register's existence. It was, the first volume came out in 1964, and this is the 56th volume of the Register. It's appropriate we're doing this today because I've just been told that today is Antonio Gramsci's birthday. It also happens to be, I understand, the birthday of Errol Sharp. He's not quite as famous, but ought to be. The Socialist Register has depended on and indeed been facilitated by, throughout its existence, by independent socialist publishers. In Britain by Merlin Press, the publisher of which was Martin Eve for most of its existence until about 2000. Martin then passed away, and Merlin Press was taken over by Tony Zerber, who still publishes the Register through Merlin Press in the UK and around the world. In Canada, in the United States, the Register has been published in '64 by Monthly Review Press. In Canada, the Register has always been published by Fernwood Books, at least since I've been editor. And Errol Sharp is the publisher, the creator of that remarkable Canadian left institution, Fernwood Books. The distributor of which is Brunswick Books, which is run by Errol's son, Lindsay Sharp, and Michael Jackal, who's here at the back. And as usual, the book table itself is run by Michael Legree of the York University Bookstore. So you should have had a flyer with the front and back cover of the Register, and you'll see on the back cover the list of essays in the Register, and I hope that will induce you, once you've seen that, to go into the back room and purchase a copy, if for no other reason than to keep the independent booksellers alive. This volume of the Register, and I know this is nothing to be proud of, is the first of the 56 volumes in which a majority of the essays were written by women. That partly, but only partly, has to do with the explicit attempt in this particular volume to look at new ways of living in terms of social reproduction, the reconstruction of cities, ecological environmental issues, and so on. And it's therefore very appropriate that we have two of the women contributors who come in from out of town for this launch. Amy Bartholomew has an outstanding essay in the Register, co-written with Hilary Wainwright, called Beyond the Barbed-Wire Labyrinth. And it's an incredible analysis, dissection, critique, plea for simple human morality, which examines the plight of the refugees who arrived in Greece in recent years, and the extent to which even the Syriza government capitulated to the European Union even more on what it did to the refugees than what it did in terms of reinstituting austerity. Amy teaches at Carleton University in the Department of Law. She's published in the Register before. You may remember her outstanding essay in the 2004 volume on the new imperialism, her essay called Human Rights as Swords of Empire, which then seeded a book on essentially that topic. So it's great to have Amy back in the Register.
Thanks, Leo. I think I need to say that I'm not sure it was a great idea to have 1.5 glasses of wine before this.
Closer to the mic, please.
Closer to the mic, got it. Usually I yell. But I will do my very best. So as Leo says, I wrote this article with Hilary Wainwright, and the title of it is, I'm looking at it here, is Beyond the Barbed Wire Labyrinth, Migrant Spaces of Radical Democracy. And before I begin, I want to really thank Leo and Greg for the real honor of publishing this in the Socialist Register. So, in the context of the largest refugee and migrant crisis since World War II, the electoral victory of Syriza in Greece in 2015 suggested to many of us an opening to a real alternative both to social democratic politics as usual and to the rise of right-wing authoritarianism that is both fueled by and targets migration and migrants. But as Leo said in his opening, in tandem with its capitulation to the EU's memorandum demanding ruinous restructuring of the economy, Syriza also capitulated to Europe's demand to function as a prime site of refugee detention, return, and deterrence. This resulted in the containment of over 35,000 asylum seekers in the Greek islands and refugee camps that were, and of course are, widely recognized to be appalling spaces of hopelessness. Functioning as the state's and Europe's human gardener, Greece came to be a central participant in refugee detention and deterrence. Of course, the crippling mandatory public sector cuts required of Greece by the EU left the Syriza government especially ill-prepared to respond to the dramatic increase of refugees to Greece in 2015 to 2016, when 1 million people landed primarily in the Greek islands, seeking to move on to the rest of Europe. And this was turned into tragedy when the closing of the borders in Macedonia and elsewhere, when they were closed in Macedonia and elsewhere. Furthermore, Europe coerced Greece precisely on the refugee question, threatening to remove it from the Schengen zone and the Eurozone if it didn't take a leading role in deterrence, thus saving the rest of Europe from the so-called burden of the refugees. It was pressured then to be the premier watchdog at the EU's border with Turkey. Back in 1951, Hannah Arendt famously analyzed the calamity of rightlessness that accompanies mass statelessness as the deprivation of a place in the world, which makes opinion significant and actions effective. The stateless, she famously argued, are treated as merely the pawn of politics, and they're forced to live outside of the common world. She also identified camps, the so-called barbed wire labyrinth into which events had driven those who were stateless, as the routine solution for the problem of domicile of the displaced persons. The stateless were treated everywhere, she argued, as the scum of the earth, a condition itself which would go on to threaten politics. Today, when over 70 million people are identified as forcibly displaced in the world, a figure that doesn't include the 10 million officially stateless people or the millions of Palestinians who are stateless who are counted separately by the UN, we see yet again both the treatment of refugees, migrants, the stateless, as the pawn of politics, with the barbed wire labyrinth of camps metastasizing across the world. This dystopian nightmare of dehumanization continued under the Syriza government, despite its promises to end the deterrence regime of migrant detention. In February 2006, Prime Minister Tsipras objected publicly that the EU was leaving Greece to function as a permanent warehouse of souls, referring to the mass of migrants obviously stuck in Greece. But by agreeing to the EU-Turkey deal, to the development of so-called European hotspots, that is, refugee camps in the Greek islands intended to sort refugees from migrants and to detain those who do not meet the conditions for refugee status in order to prepare their return to Turkey, Greece became, or continued to be, precisely that sort of warehouse, and it did so under Syriza's watch. The conditions in the islands where those caught in the EU-Turkey regime are required to remain, where those who are caught in the EU-Turkey regime are required to remain, turns the Greek islands into Europe's Manus Islands, and these conditions are wretched. I was in them in 2016 and then again in the spring of 2019, and I think it's no exaggeration to say, as the Greek office of Amnesty International did, that they are an open wound for Greece and human rights. The island camps are rife with internal violence and are regularly attacked by neo-fascists. Sexual assault is so rampant, the women go to the restrooms at night only in groups if they go at all, for they have resorted oftentimes to wearing adult diapers in order to precisely avoid that dangerous journey. Sewage spills into the flimsy tents of the desperately overcrowded camps, which are of course also subject to the extremes of heat, cold, and flooding. And above all, I think, there's the indignity of being treated at best as objects of humanitarian aid amid the grinding purposelessness that comes with long-term waiting and worrying, with little information about what they may be waiting for, what their lives might entail. These lives of abjection, as Agamben would say, these bare, disposable lives, are signified by the hunger strikes, self-immolations, and self-hangings in the camps, by the murderous violence that pervades the camps, by the life of lions that is endured in them. That migrants are left to die not only in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas, but also in the camps is starkly borne out by these sorts of actions, as well as by the rampant mental health crises, avoidable illnesses, and the lack of physicians, psychologists, and so on. And this isn't just true of the hotspots, the official camps in the islands and elsewhere in Greece, but also in the NGO-run camps. These are places that are marked not just by precarity, but by superfluousness. Asylum seekers are treated as the pawn of politics, exactly as Arendt said back in 1951. And Zygmunt Bauman, his insight that in such places, and I quote, "Time is suspended. It is time but not history," seems particularly apt. Confirming all of this is Wasim Omar, a Syrian refugee whom I met in the NGO camp called Suda on Chios Island. And after directing and leading a 30-day hunger strike, wrote a poem about the camps. And Wasim says in part, "We refugees are no longer treated as human, we're just numbers. Politicians are playing with us like pieces on a chessboard. We are living a life as one who does not have a life." The knowledge that in government, Syriza participated in this life-destroying architecture of coercion should, I think, be deeply sobering for the left. As we recognize in our article, Syriza was coerced into accepting the hotspots and the camps. But were there really no alternatives to this extreme condition, to this meaningless life, to this incarceration outside the common world? And did Syriza do all it could within its admittedly limited space for maneuver? And it seems clear to us that it did not. In fact, Syriza also excluded solidarity groups from the camps in favor of official NGOs who could be controlled, participated in criminalizing aid to refugees provided by solidarity groups, and evicted some of the autonomous solidarity squats that had arisen during Syriza's time in office. In April 2019, the Greek army general who was appointed by Syriza as the director of the Morea camp on Lesbos, perhaps the most notorious camp, but really very much like all the others, responded to international criticism of the camp, saying that, quote, "Anyone who thinks that they can do better than us is welcome to try." Not only did his statement ignore the eviction of those who did try, the solidarity groups, the squats, and so on, but it also ignored the fact that there were much better alternatives flourishing right under the general's nose. In this cauldron of despair, this dystopian scene, the social and solidarity and anti-racist movements that emerged to cope with and contest the politics of austerity also galvanized to aid migrants. Important in this context were the emergence of solidarian migrant squats in Greece that founded on the principles of solidarity rather than either securitization or humanitarianism became an active force of radical politics founded on and in shared precarity. And chief among these squats was City Plaza Hotel in Athens. So in our chapter, Hillary and I concentrate on City Plaza Hotel Squat, which is just one of them, which was open from April 2016 until July of 2019. And our research is based on repeat visits to it, discussions with the City Plaza organizers and residents, both Greeks and migrants, discussions with associated migrant solidarity activists, series of insiders, and so on, as well as on the time spent in the camps. One of a number of refugee squats and broader refugee solidarity efforts in Greece, City Plaza's occupation was aimed at establishing it as a refugee accommodation and solidarity space. So to describe City Plaza, which I'll do extremely quickly because I'm betting many of you have some knowledge about it, it was so famous. It is a seven-story hotel that was occupied by 100 refugees and 150 solidarians shortly after the famous EU-Turkey deal went into effect. The occupation was planned and envisioned as an anti-racist and anti-capitalist challenge to the border regime, to the entrapment of tens of thousands of refugees, the mass detention of refugees in the border regions, and the disastrous living conditions for homeless refugees in the cities and also in the camps. The hotel itself was chosen in part because it's located in the heart of Athens, and thus its presence claimed, as City Plaza itself put it, the right to visibility of refugees that is denied and repressed in far-flung camps. And also because it's in a neighborhood known to be home to right-wing and anti-migrant fascists, including Golden Dawn. As one of the key organizers, Olga Lafazani, put it, the solidarians viewed it as and I quote, a radical answer to the reestablishment of borders. What we proposed, namely cohabitation in dignified conditions in the heart of the city, went against the social and spatial exclusion of the camps. Now, perhaps one half of the original group of Greek solidarians who squatted City Plaza were Syriza youth members, many of whom had been deeply alienated by the capitulation of Syriza to the EU memoranda by its participation in the Turkey-EU deal and its position on the borders and camps more generally. They certainly retained their autonomy from the border. Many distanced themselves from the party quite vociferously, and the squat insisted on its overall autonomy from the party, the state, the EU, and NGO funding. It wouldn't accept any funding whatsoever from any of these formal organizations. And yet it did provide dignified housing for refugees. It collaborated with the social pharmacies, and more generally, it worked with the network of solidarity initiatives present in Athens and internationally. Visits there, as virtually all of the press on City Plaza confirms, and there's been quite a bit of it, quickly revealed the fundamental differences between it and the camps. But going far beyond providing dignified housing, good food, privacy, and sociality for up to 400 refugees at a time, the squat was organized on the principles of horizontal self-organization, anti-racism, radical democracy, equality, freedom, and inclusion. At City Plaza, solidarians and refugees lived, worked, and struggled together, as their famous slogan proclaims, and life, political as well as social, flourished, even in the context of precarious refugee life in waiting. City Plaza was organized internally on the basis of general house assemblies and so on, as you would expect. Tasks were shared and rotated and so on. It viewed itself as an ongoing political project, not a humanitarian site, and in so doing, it sought to develop and publicize a counterexample of coexistence that challenged all of the routine solutions to mass migration. So in these ways, and many others that we tried to set out in the chapter, City Plaza Hotel exercised prefigurative politics, and it enacted rights by living as if migrants had the rights that they do not in reality have. It also, of course, contested private property rights in favor of the commons. And in all of this, it both enacted and also demanded a right to have rights, as again, Arendt put it. That is, a right to belong, to membership in a place where one's words and actions might have effect because one is treated as an equal. But the squat also demanded rights from the state, despite its autonomy from the state. It demanded social rights and so on. It demanded freedom of movement for the refugees, the right to remain, and so on. It was also crucially, I think, important as a hub of political struggle in Athens and beyond, by organizing protests, holding political meetings and events, developing creative media alternative media campaigns, I mean to say, and in integrating the refugees into this radical space and into these sorts of practices. Now, rather remarkably, one of those organizers, Lafazani, has also written about the project self-critically. She's honestly recognized that it was not, despite their principles, devoid of its own exclusions or troubles, its own inequalities, and so on, some of which were the product of the fact that, despite its own open borders philosophy, the squat itself had to develop a door policy, for it was in such high demand that it simply could not take in all of the refugees that wanted to join it. But what City Plaza demonstrated at its best, we think, was that there was an alternative to the camps and to the type of degrading camps that Syriza had a hand in producing. It challenged Syriza's realpolitik and showed long before the director of the Morea camp said that anyone who thinks they can do better than us is welcome to try, that someone had and did. In doing so, it showed through its actions that the barbed-wire labyrinth of camps was a political choice that Syriza and the Greek government had made, not an inescapable fact. Now, perhaps the disappointing thing is that I've spoken of City Plaza in the past tense because it closed its doors several days after New Democracy won the July 2019 election. I was back in Canada by then, and when I learned that it was closed down, I assumed immediately, when I learned on Facebook, of course, where else does one learn these things, I assumed immediately that it had been evicted by New Democracy, because New Democracy had already started evicting some of the squats very quickly after the election. But it turns out this was wrong, that City Plaza Hotel had been talking about the possibility of closing its doors for over a year by the time it finally decided to, just after New Democracy won the election. Its reasoning, according to many people I spoke with, for closing its doors was primarily the exhaustion of energies that's necessary to such a difficult and long-term project as they had started at City Plaza Hotel, and also the depletion of resources over time. He refused to legalize the squat, which would have effectively turned it into an NGO or a state-run organization, and it chose self-consciously, and after much, I think, difficult deliberation, and after finding decent places for the remaining refugees who were still living there, it chose self-consciously to close it down on its own terms, rather than to wait to be evicted. But in a public statement as well, City Plaza talked about its decision to close, and it also said that it decided to close, and this decision had to do with the, quote, ideological, political, and organizational crisis within the movement itself. So then, and I'm getting close to the end, so then, what are some of the conclusions that we might draw about Syriza's social democratic politics and its relationship to radical solidarian movements? And what, if any, lasting effect might a prefigurative project like City Plaza have? To address the former question, undoubtedly inadequately, but to try to address the former question, both Syriza and the Solidarians seem to have diminished their radically political possibilities by the reciprocal relations of, if not antagonism always, then of distancing themselves from one another. On Syriza's side, despite its early close connection to the movements, once in office, it failed or refused to view the movements as integral to transforming the party and the state practices and policies, and therefore it tended to make many of the same compromises as the traditional social democratic left has. And in the process, I think it really undermined itself. It distanced itself from the movements that were creating a new landscape of radical politics, such that its power as a transformative capacity was hobbled. As to the second question, as to the question of what sort of lasting effect, if any, that City Plaza and the other sorts of initiatives like this might have, I think that the memory of it and the experiences there of both successes and troubles and errors remain important. It may not have been a concrete utopia, that is, as Ernest Bloch put it, a paradoxical utopia of an anticipatory kind, which by no means coincides with abstract utopian dreaminess, etc. But for both the radical solidarians and the political party, I think these experiences and this memory are important to reflect upon for the future. Finally, we think that this reveals yet again that the parties of the left need fundamentally to transform the relations with the movements like the solidarity movements in Greece and vice versa. For it's only through relations between the parties and the movements that something as calamitous and widespread as violent borders, violent camps, and the bare life they produce can be resisted and replaced.
Thank you, Amy. You can see why Amy and Hillary's essay is up at the front end of the volume. We asked all of the contributors not only to address the neoliberal market utopia, dystopia we are living in, but also to address new ways of living. And in doing so the way that Hillary and Amy did, and they certainly did by pointing to one of the most remarkable prefigurative politics one can find in the contemporary world, they did so in a way that was not abstractly utopian. Not only looking at what City Plaza was and did, but also examining the contradictions that it faced as it tried to do those things. So it epitomized what we were hoping to achieve in this volume. some people went so far. One of them people here will know well, Roger Kyle, who teaches at York in environmental studies, has actually a piece in the volume called Communism in the Suburbs. Well, you may think that's going too far to the utopian side as opposed to the dystopian, all the more so since it's an essay about Los Angeles. And yet, precisely by pointing to the way in which radical practices, even in Los Angeles, at the beginning of the 20th century and the mid-20th century, offered ways out of what Los Angeles became, and the way that is now being picked up in struggles in Los Angeles manages to do that as well. Well, in her piece, Michelle Chen undertakes an analysis of the impact of digital capitalism, of artificial intelligence, of platform capitalism, and its impact on working people in a way that fully recognizes the dystopian side of that impact. But as she says right at the outset, does not conclude from that all that can happen is that people will be left precarious or worthless. Her thesis is that there are struggles going on which would still allow the new technologies to become handmaidens of liberation and the commons, rather than means of marginalization and exploitation. So Michelle, please.
So I wrote about organizing in the so-called gig economy for my contribution to the Socialist Register, but for this talk I wanted to step back a little bit and talk about this thing called the future of work, which is a phrase that is often bandied about a lot these days. Everyone from labor unions to even the people who are meeting in Davos this week talk about this thing called the future of work, and I wanted to sort of interrogate that phrase a little bit and maybe dismantle some of the myths around that. And talk about how sort of our anxieties about technology and the gig economy are shaping the way that we think about work and the way that we see ourselves as workers. So, a lot has been said about the so-called future of work, but our idea of what our jobs will look like in the future seems to keep getting foggier. On the one hand, we feel like we're constantly anticipating the future, but we're also told that we're already living in it in many ways. A century ago, John Maynard Keynes predicted that technology would shrink the work week down to 15 hours. In the mid-20th century, it seemed like future generations would be replicating a Leave It to Beaver style domestic sphere in the space age, the Jetsons. Kurt Vonnegut envisioned a dystopian future of robot-driven obsolescence. And we see sort of echoes of that in our popular culture today. People have been predicting a future in which there is no work left to do for many years. We have a presidential candidate who's predicting this very thing. And yet this future never quite seems to come. Work never seems to go away. The debate around the future of work and the mystique surrounding this thing called the future doesn't seem to address the future of workers very much. It addresses the work as an abstract. But it's a useful platform for considering these disturbing visions of hyper-exploitation in an ultra-competitive global economy, as well as the prospect of environmental collapse or apocalyptic warfare, and the subordination of society and human emotion to automation. Those are very real ideas for us, even if we don't necessarily see them playing out in our everyday lives just yet. So the title of this year's Socialist Register is Beyond Market Dystopia, but I will try to refrain from being too much of a downer for this one. The issues I addressed in my essay are primarily related to these two major questions that we're faced with as we move towards a world of labor in which jobs are being redefined and sometimes replaced at a rate that we've never really seen before. First, what will our jobs look like in the next 50 to 100 years? Or the jobs for our children, for that matter. Second, what will be the role of the worker? Young people in particular these days are particularly ambivalent about their role in this emerging economy. On the one hand, as digital natives, they should be better equipped than their parents or their grandparents have been for these types of changes, and yet they're also realizing that the workforce they are entering may offer them comparatively few opportunities to engage in what we traditionally know as work, and instead they will be pressured to monetize themselves, their behavior, and increasingly their data for the profit of others. So it's obvious that technology is changing the way both labor and capital work. It has for centuries now. For many of us, this change is happening, it's being changed beyond recognition. So we're facing a future in which breakneck technological change will determine our vocations, our social aspirations, as well as our political limitations. And every opportunity this change opens up for making our livelihoods better also opens opportunities for the institutions that have always controlled capital to capture the innovations of the future and use them to undermine workers' power. So the math of the new workforce is rather daunting from the outset. The World Economic Forum, characteristically taking a rosy view of the future of capital, projects that in the next few years, about 75 million jobs will be eliminated through some form of technological or innovation. At the same time, 133 million new jobs will supposedly be created through some combination of automation, artificial intelligence, and other forms of sort of the digitalization of capital. But this net gain figure, sort of 133 over 75, doesn't tell us very much about the quality of those jobs or how they would affect our lived experience as workers. In reality, much of the work generated by an increasingly digitized and atomized economy is going to be more precarious, more casualized, less connected to the state, as well as the commercial institutions that have historically provided for workers' welfare, for instance, Social Security, health insurance. This also has implications for our democracy. Technology has been supremely empowering to individuals as consumers, though not as citizens. And in fact, the empowerment of consumers has only fueled the slow usurpation of the power of the citizenry by corporate power. Because insofar as it remains in the hands of capital, technology is the tool by which corporations consolidate their control over workers, and workers can likewise wield technology to increase their own power and autonomy. Yet, that's where the potential lies, and the future of that rivalry remains unscripted. Alongside the concerns about automation and artificial intelligence, we face the prospect of jobs becoming increasingly fissured. Often this is spurred by technology. We see this playing out in work platforms such as Mechanical Turk, which is owned by Amazon, which sort of hacks online projects down into little micro work modules. They're tiny tasks that are contracted out like digital piecework, and people sort of earn their money, might be cents on the hour for the type of work that they do. Our work might also be mediated through an online platform, while the jobs remain fairly similar to what we've been seeing throughout the 20th century. So we have digital apps these days that connect nannies with families needing childcare. And of course, the quintessential gig economy job is the driver for hire who gets passengers fed to his phone via Uber or Lyft, but at the end of the day, he's still just a taxi driver. But the fear of our economic future should be tempered by the fact that gig work isn't really new, even if the way jobs are distributed and the sectors that they are inhabiting are changing. We've always had jobbers, hustlers, casuals, temps, helpers, tour boys. And it's not true that these liminal gig jobs are taking over the economy, even though we as consumers of companies like Uber, Grubhub, Deliveroo, we see them as common everyday brands. Most of us still work for so-called standard wage jobs, though we may not be making a living wage or have a stable schedule. So, I mean, even a company like Amazon, the workforce is primarily direct hires, right? These are not necessarily all subcontracted out or divvied up through an app. So here are some data points that indicate where the workforce is in the US currently. A little over 1 in 10 of us work in so-called non-standard arrangements. So 9 in 10 jobs are basically workaday jobs that are pretty typical. You're on the payroll. And it might be a crappy job, but legally speaking, it's still regular employment, right? So we're not all gig workers. And fears of the gig economy have been somewhat overestimated. In 2015, an influential study by economists Alan Kruger and Lawrence Katz estimated that a huge majority of the jobs produced since the recession were short-term contingent jobs. But by 2019, the authors published a correction of that study, conceding that their methodology was flawed in part because they overestimated the change in the number of people taking on odd jobs in the so-called recovery after the recession, and they failed to properly account for individuals working multiple part-time jobs. So it sort of shows that what we often attribute to these waves of technology taking over, or we often think are huge structural changes in the economy, they're just sort of different manifestations of long-standing trends of precarity and casualization. There have always been gig jobs, right? They've operated as kind of a release valve when the job market has been slow or deflated or decimated, as it was in the Great Recession. Over time, when full-time work becomes available, people gravitate towards odd jobs. However, the growth of the gig economy revealed that the narrative around the future of work is sometimes getting ahead of itself in terms of current trends in the labor force, and it also speaks to some of our anxieties around the technologization of the workplace. Greg Rosowski at National Public Radio, a columnist, he pointed out that, quote, the dawn of the new gig economy has seemed plausible because the internet has been dramatically reducing transaction costs. E-commerce has made it easier to process payments, and you can click a button on a mobile phone and instantly have a GPS guide drivers right to your door. But as big as these efficiency gains have been, a new economy based on crowds of people doing gigs through digital platforms, as exciting or scary as that might sound, still doesn't compare to the one based on the efficiencies and stabilities of the good old-fashioned company, unquote. So we have two different pictures of change that are going on here. They sometimes seem at odds with each other, but I think they both speak to very real trends about what's happening with the psyche of the worker in the neoliberal economy. Right? If gig economy projections have been overstated, the narrative of a dystopian future does have very real implications. And this vision of a digitized, globalized future reflects and shapes our lived reality as workers and the growing anxieties that come with it. Many workers are feeling increasingly restive, rattled not just by politics, but by the uncertainties of an economic recovery that seems to be benefiting some and harming others. Despite the fact that we're more than a decade past the financial crisis that triggered the recession, many are still far from recovering from that devastation of mass unemployment and financial predation. As we're struggling to get a toehold in the economy, we're thinking much more anxiously about these new formations of capital. But we've also witnessed a wave of strikes, an unprecedented wave of strikes in recent memory across the United States. I don't know how it's been in Canada, but I'm just talking about the United States context, which suggests a new wave of militancy that's coursing through the workforce in many ways. And these have happened among tech workers, as well as among more traditional vocations like teachers and auto workers. Labor actions have ranged from relatively symbolic one-day strikes launched by fast food workers, another gig economy or precarious economy sector that's been organizing, to teacher strikes, and these have come from militant established teachers unions in major cities. And they've also come from teachers who are sort of self-organizing in Republican-controlled states like West Virginia. And 2018 actually saw a record number of strikes. And the largest of these were fed by the teacher union strikes. So Arizona, for example, turned out about 81,000 teachers and school staff for a 6-day work stoppage. And the total number of sort of worker-led industrial actions in 2018, I believe, led to about 486,000 lost days of work. Hotel workers and steel workers also went on strike. And General Motors workers ended up following the teachers' lead when tens of thousands of union workers went on strike last fall. Not all of these strikes were completely successful, but they undoubtedly made an impression and shaped the public discourse around how ordinary Americans feel about their economic situation. And it countered the cheerful narrative that the Trump administration paints, of course, about how this is the awesomest economy ever. Unions are now seeing the highest approval ratings in public opinion polls in over a decade, and that shows that people are increasingly interested in engaging in politics at the grassroots level, even if they are increasingly disgusted with their elected representatives, and also engaged in forms of work that may sort of atomize them from their coworkers or make them feel sort of alienated in their workplace. The question for the labor movement is how to preserve this collective ethos and to reshape it to fit the contours of an increasingly digitized, globalized future. One of the perils of contingent and precarious work in the gig economy is that in centering the work experience on the individual, we lose sight of the meaning of solidarity and how to work collectively toward a more just system. The labor movement impulse of capitalists to separate and turn workers against each other and detach them from the process of work so that they no longer feel invested in either the act of production nor the products that they make. And the growing subset of jobs that we can define as bad jobs, the jobs with low pay, crappy benefits, long, unstable hours, erratic schedules, the vacuum that is created by that is leads to the soul-crushing drudgery of that work leaves a vacuum, and that's filled by a corporate culture that sort of operates in an increasingly freewheeling way. Thinking about the Silicon Valley companies that operate sort of like patriarchal frat houses with way too much money. So this is especially true for younger workers who are becoming increasingly politically aware and often want to seek jobs that reflect their values in some way, and who feel increasingly disillusioned by neoliberalism, having grown up in the Great Recession and perhaps are graduating with crushing amounts of student debt. They may not be able to articulate a class analysis when they reflect on their struggle to find a place in the world, but the longer they're unable to reach that consciousness, they risk becoming reduced to a byproduct of this economy that they've aged into. The relationship between employers and workers is changing both in the mainstream workforce and in the so-called gig economy, and there's an increasingly cynical attitude towards finding and keeping jobs on the part of workers, coupled with the normalization of precarity in the workforce. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, between millennials between the ages of 18 and 28 have held an average of 7.2 jobs each. Baby boomers, meanwhile, have had an average of 11.9 jobs from the age of 18 to 50. Right? So we're talking about a much higher degree of labor force churn, even within an individual's lifetime. This constant churn of the workforce can pose a challenge to organizers, but it also means that workers are increasingly independent and increasingly willing to leave employers when they're dissatisfied. Increasingly cynical about things like career advancement, things that our idea of the middle class has traditionally been built on. So digital technology is part of this process of fracturing and fissuring in the workforce. And we're witnessing a wholesale restructuring of industries that make it easier for labor to be sourced from across the country or even around the world. And yet there is increasing uncertainty about the quality of these jobs, who will work for them, for whom, on whose terms. And as more young people move into systems of work that are intertwined with online communication, we need to recast the idea of class relationships. So say, take a platform like Mechanical Turk. The work itself is performed remotely online. It's sort of overseen by this behemoth company, Amazon, even though these workers are technically self-employed. Right? And they're engaged in tasks such as writing code or copy editing or even filling out surveys. And after the task is completed, the workers are rated, and quality control is enforced through these subjective consumer ratings that are designed to provide accountability for each of these mechanical Turkers, as they like to call themselves. So it's a scarcely regulated labor market that operates more or less like a digital hiring hall. And who controls the quality of the job itself? The traditional formal labor laws and standards that you would usually apply in ordinary wage work, these workers are largely detached from those standards because, legally speaking, they're not employees of the company that they work for. They're just users of the app. On paper, they're sole proprietors. They have clients who are the people that the app matches them up with. Things get even hairier when we factor in the fact that management is increasingly no longer a human enterprise. We see our work evaluated through a set of algorithms and artificial intelligence-based programs that basically outsource decision-making to a supposedly more efficient and objective arbitrator, even though many of those algorithms are embedded with a lot of racial bias and a lot of assumptions that come out of the experiences and the worldviews of the people who design this, who are obviously not representative of the wider economy. So it's necessary to grapple with the fact that there will be job displacement among blue-collar and service jobs as the future of work happens. And most of these projections suggest that the main job losses will be concentrated in low and moderate income jobs, data entry, retail service jobs. Often these are jobs that are disproportionately performed by women, and women as a whole will likely face larger scale displacement. Even among so-called knowledge workers, the increased use of subcontracting and other fissured work arrangements, and the digitalization of some of this work as well through online platforms, It's disrupting sort of an article of faith in the American economy, which is that a college education to be the key to middle-class opportunity, and a diploma is an investment in one's future. Those investments are increasingly difficult to realize. At the same time, just because work is changing doesn't mean jobs are going to vanish. The displacement of human workers by machines may be inevitable to some extent, but the quality of that work is what we should be concerned about. It's the future of workers versus the future of work, as some labor activists have said. And if we are truly striving for economic democracy, we must be concerned about the extent to which ordinary workers will be empowered to determine the nature and the conditions of their work. And that can include having a say over how robotic technology and AI will penetrate their livelihoods, or creating a collective bargaining contract in which they have the first right of refusal every time a new form of digital innovation is introduced to their workplace. The danger of technology for workers today is not so much being displaced by it, but being controlled by it. As surveillance capitalism becomes embedded in managerial regimes, workers are increasingly watched, sometimes outright policed at work. And of course, the tracking of workers is hardly a product of the digital age per se. Scientific management through surveillance and regimentation goes back to Taylorism and early 20th century factory work, right? But in the same way that artificial intelligence and algorithmic models have made the study of consumption habits a kind of behavioral science, surveillance at work has intensified workplace oppression, forcing people to toil under the watchful eye of a manager who can use software to register a slight slowdown in packing boxes at an Amazon warehouse, or excessive shuffling or too many bathroom breaks for a driver in a UPS truck. Globally, the picture looks even more daunting. Perhaps in poorer countries, young people are also grappling with a huge unemployment crisis as well as massive technological change. The young people of the so-called developing world are entering a world in which a neoliberal economic order that has provided uneven development at best is becoming increasingly intertwined with digital innovation. So across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, development has traditionally, historically, meant importing some of the dirtiest, harshest jobs and industries to countries starving for foreign investment. It has simultaneously stimulated migration to richer parts of the world, and that can both exacerbate global wealth divides as well as foster economic advancement in the communities that export labor. But the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, right, another moniker that's associated with the future of work, it's one of the big themes at Davos right now, actually. It will affect wealthy and poor countries very differently. The trajectory of development in poor and middle-income countries could be upended by artificial intelligence, automation, and other technology to an even greater extent that we see in wealthy countries. Roboticization might short-circuit job development in under-resourced countries because there will be automated technological solutions for the tasks that used to require people. And those jobs were very much relied upon to sort of develop and modernize these economies. So I just want to end with a couple of notes about regulation of the gig economy. So I don't think we necessarily need to fear a future of techno-dystopia. To date, most governments have lagged woefully behind in standing up to Silicon Valley, just as they have often failed to impose meaningful oversight or regulation of the private sector workplaces more generally. However, this is slowly changing as people become more vigilant about protecting their rights at work, digital or otherwise, just as they're increasingly concerned about their privacy as consumers. In the US, California became the first state to seriously attempt to regulate gig work, taking special aim at Uber and Lyft, with a law called AB 5, and it aims to combat the problem of this classification, as when a company tries to get out of putting an employee on the official payroll is by classifying them as independent contractors. The law applies a single stringent test to ensure that workers are only classified as independent contractors if they meet criteria showing that they're truly independent workers and that they're not simply doing work for a company that refuses to acknowledge them as workers. There's also a lot of self-organizing going on in the gig economy. It's happening on digital platforms. Some of these are new creations, such as Uber drivers forming autonomous online forums on which to communicate, exchange grievances, and give each other advice. We've also seen industrial actions, such as Deliveroo drivers engaging in several high-profile work stoppages across Europe. They engaged in a number of spontaneous boycotts of the app in 2017, which is effectively a strike. So they shut off the app in a coordinated fashion. It happened across several countries across Europe, affecting only about 1,500 workers, right? So not necessarily denting their profit flows for that day, but it nonetheless made a statement about how these workers are actually able to coordinate and think of themselves as a collective workforce. So I think these small uprisings in the platform economy reflect new ideas about organizing in the gig economy. And they're basically extensions of labor conflicts that have been with us for generations. Last year, we saw one of the biggest strikes of Uber drivers across the country and across several cities around the world. And it was right around the time that Uber was getting ready to drop its initial public offering. And through sort of media savvy and coordination through mobile networks, these drivers were able to initiate a strike that happened around the world. And it didn't necessarily, halt Uber's operations for that day, but it definitely made a huge media impact, and it showed that companies like Uber are not invincible, right? They're not just, running roughshod over regulations and being able to get away with it. There are workers who are aware of exactly what they're doing and how they're being exploited, and they're able to think of themselves with a collective conscience. We're embarking on an era in which we may gain much more power to determine what we do for a living, but we may also lose a lot of power and freedom over where, when, and for whom we work. It's not technology, though, that threatens that power so much as the power controlling the technology. Collective action is as relevant for platform-based workers and gig workers today as it was for dock workers and machinists 100 years ago. The struggle for workers' self-determination hasn't changed, but the battleground has shifted. Today we are less tied to our workplaces, less tied to a single employer, and many of us feel physically and psychologically dislocated in an economy that feels increasingly unmoored and chaotic. But digital communications and the fluidity of global capital are also creating more connective tissue between workers around the world, so that many of us feel more connected to our shared experiences as workers. And that's the part of the so-called sharing economy that the bosses don't want you to know about.
Thanks, Michelle. So, as with every volume of the Register, our concern, of course, is to try to do this hard work of writing and thinking, and the hard work that goes into reading these essays as well, in a way that pertains to socialist strategy, to getting from here to there. The final essay in the volume by Nancy Fraser is called "What Should Socialism Mean in the 21st Century?" The first essay in the volume jumps right into the fray today, with the way in which class politics and a socialist discourse and proclaimed socialist policy have been articulated inside, of all places, the American Democratic Party and the British Labour Party by Sanders and Corbyn. And it tries to look at those both generously and soberly in light of capitalist constraints. And that's what Sam Gindin and Steve Maher are going to talk about now. I don't know who's going first.
I'm going to go first. And I'm not going to try to summarize the argument in the essay, but I'm going to just kind of talk around the argument and frame what we tried to do in the essay enough to interest you to go buy our lovely commodity back there and read it for yourself. So the essay was titled Class Politics, Socialist Policies, and Capitalist Constraints. And I think that the title is actually really appropriate because the essay really does try to deal with the relationship, which is not an unproblematic one, between the power and political capacities of the working class, the socialist policies that may be proposed by any left government that comes to power, Sanders, Corbyn, or somebody else, and the nature of the constraints that they face that are posed by the capitalist system in which they ultimately are trying to transform through a combination of socialist policies and class politics. And with that framing, we then look at, in some detail, the policies that were proposed by Sanders, Corbyn, and McDonnell in the UK, and Elizabeth Warren in the US as a kind of progressive liberal foil to determine to what extent the policies proposed by the socialists go beyond the limits of what's been proposed by Elizabeth Warren. And I think the essay actually draws out that comparison quite interestingly. But the challenge of this essay that we faced, and I mean it was a challenge, it really was a challenge, to think this through historically. And by historically, I don't just mean in the sense of knowing more about the past, but locating oneself at a point in history, registering the fault lines in that moment in history, and sketching a way forward from there, based on an understanding of how politics is shaped by our historical moment and how change arises from contradictions within that moment. So we can't project ourselves into an ulterior universe in which it is possible for Bernie Sanders to simply get elected with a majority vote on a platform of seizing the means of production immediately and have that then occur in an immediate socialist revolution the first day of his administration. We have to think through, in a meaningful historical sense, exactly what is possible and how what is possible can serve to change the constraints to create new possibilities in the future. In our current historical moment, as we're probably all aware, is marked primarily or significantly by a legitimacy crisis of neoliberalism. Now, it's interesting because on the surface of it, it appears that there's this great opening for the left. The Jeremy Corbyn and Momentum in the UK and Bernie Sanders and the DSA in the US is an incredibly hopeful development in terms of the future of the socialist movement in the English-speaking world. But it's important to recognize that one of the most distinctive features of our moment is that this opening for the left that appears to exist is the result not of the strength of the left, but of the weakness of the center. So this opening for the left comes in a very peculiar fashion, in a very peculiar form, which is that the left is weak, but so is the center. Neoliberalism is in crisis, but so is the left. And this crisis of neoliberalism encapsulates as well the social democratic and center-left parties across the advanced capitalist world, certainly the Democratic Party in the US and the Labour Party in the UK. This is because those parties largely turned toward, over the 1980s and certainly the 1990s, market-based restructuring and the third way platforms that discredited them along with neoliberalism. Now, just as we can't simply reboot the New Deal of the 1930s because of the way that the state and social relations have changed in that time, and we can't simply reboot social democracy in the post-war sense in Europe, at the same time, the far left parties, the insurrectionist parties and the vanguardist parties have remained marginal. So they also don't offer a meaningful way forward toward a real social transformation. So what to do? This is the fundamental dilemma that the DSA and Momentum face. And the possibility that Sanders or Corbyn might get elected, or any left government that could follow them might get elected, raises the question of what could they actually do with state power that could transform this situation. If we want to criticize the policies that they're putting forward now, what policies should they put forward? Could the policies that they're putting forward now be built upon so that we can actually transform the balance of class forces and create new possibilities for more radical policies? So the central dilemma that we tried to grapple with is that large moves, huge changes at this particular moment are impossible based on the balance of class forces and the weakness of labor and the left. But at the same time, gradual moves, gradual steps forward, risk simply being co-opted by the system and doing nothing other than renewing social democracy, a reformist social democracy that's not capable and ultimately not able to move past capitalist social relations. So this is a dilemma, this is a paradox. But this paradox emerges hopefully, and I mean that not hopefully, I mean in a very hopeful sense. It emerges on the basis of a clear recognition on both sides of the Atlantic that we need to overcome the limits of protest movements like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter while also building on their successes. So it's not simply a matter of saying they had it all wrong, but it's a matter of recognizing that these social movements, these extra-parliamentary militant protest movements, left a very meager, at best, organizational legacy. So we need to find a way to build on that. We need to find a way to build durable left capacities that transform the power of the working class and the balance of class forces over time. Indeed, one could even suggest, that inasmuch as these extra-parliamentary movements were successful or effective, It was partly through creating or opening space for legislative reforms and entering the state. Again, with all the limits that that entails, but you can't listen to Bernie Sanders give a speech, for example, without hearing him talk about the 99%. And that discourse clearly is picking up on something that Occupy imprinted upon the public mind as the basic framework through which common sense understandings of class relations are today understood. But it's also worth pointing out that the major protest movements of the Trump era against the Muslim ban and the Women's March, the so-called Muslim ban of Donald Trump and the Women's March, have also shared similar shortcomings and have thus far failed to leave much of an organizational legacy. So we're in this conundrum. And this is what the democratic socialist movement around Sanders and Corbyn in the UK are grappling with. I think part of what needs to be asked in this context is what base-building projects, so-called base-building projects, are possible at this particular moment in history, and how can they be reinforced by or relate to electoral politics? Now, of course, we all know that Jeremy Corbyn lost the election in the UK, and it's somewhat likely, very likely, that Bernie Sanders will do the same in the US, although I remain hopeful. Not everybody agrees, but it's somewhat likely that he won't win. So we need to then ask ourselves how to wage an electoral campaign such that something is left behind after the electoral campaign is possibly lost or even won, that can push forward a radical set of reforms that can lead us toward a qualitative social shift. There's also another dilemma. Even if Bernie Sanders wins the election, or even if Jeremy Corbyn had won the election in the UK, there is the challenge of despite the fact that neither of these political leaders or the movements that support them have advanced a politics of class compromise in the old social democratic sense, both of them are uncompromisingly militant in their approach to the capitalist class. But nevertheless, there is the reality that upon entering the capitalist state, that state remains a capitalist state. It will govern society in a way that reproduces, stabilizes, etc., capitalist social relations. So in that context, governing a state that is stabilizing and reproducing capitalist social relations, how do you maintain a mobilized social base behind these leaders, behind these policies that they're going to be proposing, despite the fact that there are going to be inevitable compromises, disappointments, etc., as the capitalist system throws up the inevitable contradictions that it will as these leaders try to govern? The key phrase, or the key point, I think, in this regard, is the need to build organizations that sustain, rather than undermine, socialist political forces over time, both in the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party, in the Labor Party and outside the Labor Party, in the labor movement. This is about building an organizational infrastructure that can expand working class political capacities and transform the balance of class forces in a way that goes beyond one election. We also need to address the limits and contradictions that come with not only working within a capitalist state, but also within parties that remain definitively non-socialist and are actually set up to undermine or deflect insurgencies and socialist political forces within those parties, and have been quite successful at doing that over time. So this isn't like even entering a capitalist state with a socialist party fully unified and organized behind a particular agenda to transform society. These are individual leadership groups within capitalist parties, or at least parties oriented toward social democracy and class compromise, that are actually working within the party to undermine these leaders' possibilities of implementing substantial radical change. So in this context, how can we connect the extensive radical reforms which are possible in this context, such as the Fight for 15, criminal justice reform, expanding social provision, and universal health care, with a broader, longer-term strategy for qualitative social transformation? After all, one of the great, I think, risks or shortcomings of the Bernie Sanders campaign in the US, for example, is the equation of socialism with healthcare. Socialism is not healthcare. Socialism is a restructuring of the productive relations of society such that the economy becomes democratically managed and accountable to social needs. So how do we then link the struggle for universal health care with the struggle to transform society in a much deeper and more profound way, to democratize production so that it meets social needs? And it's on that basis that we address the need to implement reforms that don't merely strengthen capitalism, but rather build the power, cohesion, and capacities of the working class to struggle for broader and deeper reforms than what is possible today. And with that, I'll turn to Sam to finish up.
I'm really tempted to say that should finish it up. That was great, Steve.
Thanks.
I want to start with the point that Steve made, which I think really shaped the article that Leo, Steve, and I did, which is that the central dilemma we face is that we're living in a moment when giant steps are necessary, but they're not possible. And as Steve said, small steps may be possible, but they're inevitably going to be swallowed up by the powerful logic of capital. And one of the things that this should affect is our attitude to thinking about these things. That we need to approach these issues and the relationship to the left with a degree of humility, with some respect for how difficult this really is, with some appreciation of what's been achieved in changing the discourse, in delegitimating neoliberalism, in raising questions of anti-capitalism, as vague as that might be, and in making it legitimate to raise the question of socialism in public discourse, again, as vague as that might be. So the question, the attitude in approaching this is not a question of how do we apportion blame for particular politicians or movements, but how do we think about what can we really learn from this? That's the question from these experiences and their and these experiments, basically. In doing that, though, we have to be sober. We have to find a way of being critical about this that is sober, because we have to be honest about the limits of what is being proposed, because that's the only way we can prepare for what really needs to be done. And as impressive as some of the policies, it's not just impressive, it's so important to see people going beyond the meek social democracy that we've had before and to put some things on the agenda that are more radical. But the reality is that what's being put on the agenda is still behind what was put on in the 70s, what was put on half a century ago. And here we are, when it is even more important to think bigger and be more radical. We're not even there. So there's that question of the limits of the policy. But there's a more important limit, and that is that the issue isn't just policies, it's an alternative politics. The question of what socialist parties are isn't a question of are they more radical and more militant, as important as that may be. The question is, what are they doing so that we can actually have the power to implement these things? And that means, what are they doing in terms of building the kind of class capacities that Steve has talked about? Of making it a priority to think that whatever we're doing, whatever struggles we're engaged in out of necessity to defend people, what does it have to do with building capacities, building the capacity to understand, the capacity to organize, the capacity to debate in a comradely way, etc. That is what's critical. And when we think of it that way, this translates into how we look at the Green New Deal and the question of a just transition. Because on the one hand, it's very exciting to see that people have been able to put the environment and the Green New Deal on the agenda. That's fantastic. They've brought all kinds of young people, not just young people, but especially young people, into politics, and that's crucially important. But there's some very important limits, and we have to talk about those limits. So when we talk about a just transition, it means very little to workers. They see it as a nice intent. They see it generally as a slogan that's a little bit abstract, because it doesn't deal with how would you actually implement that. How do you tell workers that there'll be a just transition if you're not talking about planning? You cannot do this without planning. You cannot fix the environment or deal with restructuring or guarantee any kind of security to working people without talking about planning. And you can't talk about planning unless you raise property relations and with confidence and aggressively challenge capital and corporate power. The other thing that's crucial to the environmental movement, which raises the issue of links to the working class, is it has to engage the working class. It cannot just preach to them and try to make them aware of how urgent everything is. It actually has to engage them in concrete struggles. And the importance of talking about conversion, as has happened in the case of Oshawa and GM, the importance of talking about conversion is that it begins to link these things. It links the environment and how everything is going to we're going to need all kinds of capacities to address the environment because everything is going to be changed, to people's jobs who are facing closures and want to know, well, what are you actually going to do about closures, and linking those closures to converting them to doing socially useful and especially environmentally important things. And it also links these questions to planning, the restructuring, and maintaining the capacities so that we can actually do something about the environment. And in each community, having environmental technology centers that are thinking about how can things be converted. But it doesn't stop there. As Barbara Harris-White says in her article, it isn't just a question of can we stop polluting the planet, it's a question of actually fixing the planet and nature. It's about reconstituting the environment. And what that means is that there has to be an enormous amount of investment in the environment, and it raises a number of questions. First of all, of course, who controls investment? But even beyond that, it means that if we're investing in the environment, and that is going to cost a fortune because everything has to be changed, then it means we're not investing in other things. And that raises a whole series of cultural questions, including how we define abundance. We have to change the meaning of abundance so that abundance has to do with getting our time back, it has to do with getting security in our lives, it has to do with a richer life, it has to do with collective services, it has to do with developing the capacity to enjoy music and all kinds of other cultural activities. So we're talking about a cultural change. So the question is, well, how do we get there? The question that Steve kept emphasizing. It's not good enough to say these things. The question is, what is critical to thinking about how we get there? And one of the problems, I think, on the left, in the movements, is that there's a sense that if we just raise awareness, if we just emphasize urgency, if we just emphasize social justice, if we just protest, that somehow this grows into a capacity to change society. And it doesn't. These are critical. I don't want to underestimate them. Whatever we do, those things are absolutely critical. But the barrier to getting working people involved in politics is that they have to see that there are structures that they can work through that matter. And this is what the great defeat of the last few decades, and to some extent even before that, has been about. Workers do not see unions today as having the capacity to change society in a way that's meaningful to them. They're hanging on. Movements, as Steve said, there's a potential when you have movements to bring people into politics and take it somewhere, but the movements themselves haven't created those kinds of structures. What we need is the kind of structure that is focused on how to develop these capacities, that's what it's about. It may be involved in politics, but the main question it wants to ask is how do we create structures through which we can, spaces through which we can debate strategy, spaces through which we can lead campaigns and sustain them and reproduce them and expand them and get involved in struggles, spaces which are a psychological anchor. So we ourselves feel like, yeah, this is real. This is going to sustain us. We can make a commitment to this without just seeing it as a chore. And when we're talking about that is forming socialist organizations. And this is the critical question. So when we talk about urgency, we usually frame it in, the way it's often framed, is the contradiction between environmental time or ecological time and socialist time. That the environment is demanding something immediate, and socialists are telling us that, no, you got to change a lot more and that's going to take time. But there's no way of getting around this question. If you say it's urgent, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. You have to create the structures that can deal with that urgency. And so the really urgent question for us is the question of building the kind of socialist organization that can do this. Now, when I say this, I want to emphasize, I'm not trying to say that saying we need a socialist party is a panacea. The point is that a socialist organization is a condition for addressing the 1,000,001 problems and the 1,000,001 contradictions that we have. And it's the only way we can get to the point of saying, yes, giant steps are actually possible. Thank you.
You've spent a decade or so writing on the impact of the 2008-2000 crisis on class formation, both ruling class and working classes, questions of political strategy in this context, a volume on the politics of the right, several on the crisis, rethinking revolution, rethinking democracy. Last year we turned to look more concretely at this conjuncture under the notion that we were in a different phase of capitalism as was starting to emerge, partly captured in the figures of Xi in China and Trump in the US, but also the way that there was kind of modulations occurring across the state system, modulations in reference to geoeconomics and geopolitics that were opening a range of new fractures and divisions. And to some extent, we're still a moment that was both the hardening of states in many parts of the world, but also opening for a range of the upsurges of revolt and widespread movement politics taking place in mass strikes or mass demonstrations that have been occurring around the world, notably in France, Lebanon, and so on, to capture that moment. But in thinking of this volume, it was also impossible, I think, and that gives us the title, is to deal with still the multiplication of the dystopias that are coming forward from neoliberal practices over the last 30 or I guess even 40 years. Each of the essays in the volume integrates that in the essay. One of the things that's always odd when we meet here to launch this volume, it's also a counterpoint to the Davos summit meetings in Switzerland. It's their 50th anniversary. It's our 56th volume. We think of ourselves as a mini international in opposition to that. Not always successful, but always trying and insisting. Particularly our politics of insisting not only take a realistic view of the political balance of forces and what we're facing, but also the insistence of the need for a revolutionary socialist turn. As it goes, the Financial Times, leading into the Davos summit, often captures the mood well. And I want to quote from today's lead article on the World Economic Forum. For the organizers and most of the delegates at the WEF, globalization is a positive force, reducing poverty, creating common interest between nations, and allowing the spread of technologies that can tackle complex problems like disease and environmental degradation. The forum's external critics, which would be us, have long regarded that vision as glib and delusional. Very true. They argue that it has provided rhetorical cover for a global system that has increased inequality and prioritized profit over the welfare of the planet. That is one of the themes of this volume. Amid a backlash against globalization, rising tensions between the great powers, and increasing anxiety about the environment, the image of international plutocrats gathering in a Swiss ski resort for a week of meetings and parties is more provocative than ever, very provocative. The rucksacks handed out to Davos delegates bear the conference slogan, committed to improving the state of the world. WEF detractors tend to believe that a better slogan would be committed to protecting the interests of the global elite. Absolutely. As always, the Financial Times captures, I think, both the material and ideological forms of defending the market at this point in time, and I think for us it also kind of captures well the dystopic moment. But it was also a remit that we gave each of the authors to also take up where we could find the utopic in the dystopic at this moment. There are remarkable essays around the housing struggles, the caring sector, all kind of dealing with different ways of how to deepen our decommodification struggles, around the Green New Deal, and I think Barbara Harris-White in particular develops a whole, not only a great read of the climate change crisis, but a really valuable understanding of what the content of our ecological opposition has to be in terms of taking from Marx and developing further the notion of restorative ecological practice. Some of the essays also are archaeologies of retrieval of past socialism and possible futures, partly around the architectural utopias that came with the Russian Revolution and persisted through the 20th century in the remarkable way that these utopias kind of animated kind of all kinds of architectural styles. Also in the, Leo mentioned it, also finding the residues of communism in the suburbs, not only in the past but also in the present. I hope we can find them in Canada, not just in LA. That's a bit interesting. I think also the way that all the essays and the panelists here all spoke about finding working class and socialist agencies at this moment. I want to just speak to one essay, if I can reclaim that a bit, Sam. I was at the Y this week late at night doing my usual exercise, and a group of kids, they're about 10 to 12, came out of the Taekwondo class and all of a sudden entered a political discussion. Remarkable. They were about 6 or 8 of them, and they began discussing the strikes. With one of them saying, but we're losing class time, valuable education time, and the other kids arguing, but we need to back our teachers. It's our future. And we need to be with them. And talking against the Ford, and it was quite remarkable to eavesdrop and hear them kind of animated from this discussion. And it was similar in many of the educational strikes that have occurred elsewhere in Canada, in particular some of those in the U.S. with a similar kind of dynamism. Around the world, it's the Fridays for Future and the children working and pushing the climate change issue. In an essay by Catherine Ann Mitchell and Key McFarlane, they raised this question of children and politics in a remarkable way of thinking about critical pedagogy, but also in the actual political practices. They go back to Walter Benjamin and his program for a proletarian children's theater. And I'm just going to quote some of the writing on this, initially quoting from Benjamin himself. The goal of the performance is to create a space for the radical unleashing of play. Such play works in turn to release in children the most powerful energies of the future. Benjamin wanted to harness these energies as a revolutionary force, one that turns bourgeois society upside down, such that it is adults who learn from children. Childhood is where the spaces, memories, and dreams of the past are discovered anew each generation, where they experience, as Benjamin says, an awakening. What this means is that the figure of the child is an elementary site of political struggle. In order for global capitalist society to reproduce itself over time, certain histories must be recollected while others are actively buried. Spatially situated educational practices, those that draw attention to the geographies of selective memory, help to break this dystopian violence. They point to radical spaces and legacies that have been paved over or interred, but which can be seized and recovered in ways that challenge the revolving tyranny of the present. As part of a larger emancipatory project for the future, this reclaiming of the past with and for children is paramount. I think that's also what we're living for, and that is where we are going to find new ways of living. That's one of the themes that we tried to capture in a concrete way alongside the remaking of political agencies that insisted that it's through our children and the struggles they're engaged in right now that we have to be with them, they have to be with us, and that is the future we need to build.